Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our sixth of seven Cyber Phenomena Roundtables for 2025. Today's subject is risk level agreements, risk informed decision making. I'm Mike Sheehan, and I'm on the board of ISC2 of Eastern Mass, and I organize this roundtable series along with the managing director of Phenomenati, Scott Foote. Today, we changed things around a little bit, departing from our normal roundtable series. We're going to have the two guys who know more about this subject than any two guys in the world, those two guys being Joel Jacobs and Scott Foote. A little bit about them. Joel is a nationally recognized CIO and CSO with 40 years of IT and cybersecurity leadership. At Phenomenati, he leads the virtual CIO strategy and advisory services. A CIO Hall of Fame inductee, two-time Boston CIO of the Year, and a Federal 100 Award winner, Joe serves on the board of the Advanced Cybersecurity Center and was formerly MITRE's CIO and CSO. Scott Foote is the managing director of Phenomenati, serving as the CISO, DPO, CIRO, and the chief AI officer. With 35 years in cybersecurity leadership, he has led teams from 10 to 1,000 and driven major digital transformations. Scott authored The Risk Formula and Cyber Entropy, and frequently advises boards, nonprofits, and executives on risk and security strategy. We have a lot of material to cover today and a lot of people on the call. So if you have questions, if you can put them in chat, and if we don't get to them, we can follow up with you. So with all that being said, please join me in welcoming today's presenters, Joel Jacobs and Scott Foote. Scott, take it away.
Actually, I was going to kick it over to Joel to open up with some questions that he has queued up that we can start talking about. And why don't we start with why risk level agreement? Joel, unless you want to start someplace else.
No, let's start there. Risk level agreements has a familiar ring to it, and for those of us who have been working in this space, it has the potential to solve a lot of problems. So why don't you, Scott? Can you tell the listeners where the idea came from and what's the background on it?
So it's probably not a surprise to anybody, right? It builds on the idea of a service level agreement. And where this came from was through multiple C-suite conversations and even with boards where we couldn't get all of them in the room to agree, what are we talking about in terms of risk? What are the expectations? Is it even quantifiable? It's too abstract. There were implicit assumptions. Different people knew different terms. We finally just got to the point where we said we need a concrete expression of an acceptable level of risk that's time bounded. So a risk level agreement. We're all on the same page, at least for the next X months or quarters, with respect to how much risk is appropriate for us to carry. So building on that, we start by aligning people on the terminology they're all familiar with. What is a company's risk appetite? And this is ISO 31000 or pick your favorite framework, FAIR, whatever it is. But around the risk appetite that a company has, they have some tolerance for risk to shift. And then around that, of course, we have a lack of tolerance, either too high risk or, too low risk. We can talk about some examples where companies become so risk averse they accept no risk at all, which of course quietly puts them out of business. That's just a slow death, especially in this economy. And then there's the overall risk capacity. We're not going to talk about that very much. That's usually measured, by the way, in terms of a monetary unit. What is the maximum amount that they're going to put at risk, maybe to explore a new venture? But the key terms in here, this one was one that we made up a while ago, risk level objective. This is the unstated objective that each individual board member and each C-suite member has in their head. Whether they're founders and owners or they're just promoters, they're not all on the same page. And we've noticed that when we enter the conversation, the angst in the room is about that lack of alignment. We often will have like founders accept, all the risk in the world because there's nothing to lose. They're entering a new market. They're willing to be very, very risk engaging. Where as the company matures over time, now there's more to lose. You've built up a customer base, hundreds of thousands. You've built up 10 millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions in terms of your revenue stream. that risk appetite drops, or the risk objectives, but they're not explicitly stated. That's where we brought in the idea of the risk level agreement. Where is the company? All the way down there at the bottom are very, very mature businesses that are working on maintaining a 20% profit margin. What are the risk level agreements that we need to make? And it's not one agreement for the whole company. It's actually agreements based upon every new venture, every product line, every new acquisition, every new market we get into. There are different risk level agreements that we should make explicitly before we get into those markets or opportunities. Now, hopefully that establishes why we even came up with this idea of a risk level agreement. It's 100% about clarity and alignment.
And it's a clarity and alignment among the executive team or the board or different business units. And that is something that in my experience, we've had, there's a lack of clarity about who agreed to what elements of risk and how much. You made the point about too much or too little. Too little will, if an organization, as one of our clients, it was described as risk allergic, then they're not going to take advantage of opportunities along the way. And to that point, you mentioned ISO 31000, which is the risk management standard. It has its own views, but it doesn't really talk about the agreement in principles and the process to get there. So where should an organization start? How should they determine how to use this kind of framework for their own business?
Well, first place I think that organizations usually trip up in is risk identification. They simply don't know how to do it. They don't do it well. It's abstract. They can say they feel angst about something, but they can't codify it. They can't qualify it. They can't quantify it. So let's start with teaching organizations how to actually do risk identification. There's a variety of sources I have on this slide. I hope everyone can see, whether it's threat modeling, new products. I've already talked about that. Change management is fundamental in every company. Before change, one should anticipate risk. Business impact analysis is one that we do a lot of at Phenomenati, where we will look at business, talk about all of its dependencies, its internal and external stakeholders, and then have the conversation about what could go wrong. And we typically walk that through. This is an example of a business impact analysis. No, you're not supposed to be able to read it. The point is, we look at all the dependencies in the business and we dig deeper into what does that mean for the business. Let me zoom in. That was not in, that was out. There we go. Please zoom in here. Here's an example of a functional decomp of a business where we want to prep ourselves for a discussion about what could go wrong, what risk. Direct mail campaigns right across here. It's the second row in the table. What is the function? What type of data do they work with? How can we classify that data? What is the information impact if there's damage to the data? What apps and infrastructure do we host that data in? What are the expectations of things like uptime, MT-prod and MAU, or RTO and RPO? How do we tier this in terms of where is it in the most important dependencies in the company? Then let's start to play the game of Jenga. If something happens to that risk, that's direct mail. It's just one very discrete thing, but turns out it's an operational risk to this example customer. This is a real workflow for business impact analysis. There are real security risks in terms of if they lose control of that, because that has all of their customer base and their prospects. Financial risk, because it's expensive, they're doing this on a regular basis. Regulatory, it's low there, and reputational risk. We look at all of these with the folks in marketing. We talk about what could go wrong, and then we have the ability to assess this. Where is this as we rack and stack it? This is just one simple example of how you can find risk in the business. And it takes time. It takes workshops. There's ways to shortcut it, But what's important is that you really understand across each function in the business, if this new event occurs, what is the likely damage to the business? And the way we capture that is in risk scenarios. And other than just saying what is the likelihood and what is the impact, we take it one level below that and say, no, what is the threat event? It could be a cyber threat. It could be a competitive threat. It could be social, political movements in the market. What is the threatening event? What is our vulnerability and exposure to that type of a threat? And then, frankly, what could go wrong? What are the consequences? We try to compartmentalize this so that we can address each of those parts of risk individually. And I'll end my sermon on breaking up risk scenarios by simply saying, when people say, I don't know how to do that, I say hurricanes, grass huts, and threat to life. That's a simple example. A hurricane is an external threat we cannot control. Vulnerability, grass hut, we can. And of course, the consequences, we might be able to mitigate those consequences if we have some restorative or corrective engagement following the event. But let me throw it back to you, Joel.
Yeah, I think that's an important part about where the organization can control the breakdown. As you know, the term risk gets a little bit fuzzy in different venues, and the ability to break it down into its component parts is an important mechanism for evaluating the risk and its mitigations. For each scenario, you had threats, vulnerability, and consequences, and some of the standards have a simpler likelihood and consequence as an example, or likelihood and impact. I think 31,000 uses likelihood and consequence, and they have different ways of dealing with the degrees of those. Can you talk about any further on the threats, vulnerabilities, and consequences breakdown as opposed to one of the others, one of the other frameworks?
Yeah, well, let's dive into what a risk scenario looks like with both threats, consequences, and both threats, vulnerabilities, and the subsequent consequence. One of the things, Joel, and you know that, but we've run into this a lot when people say likelihood. They're just making numbers up. It's 10% likelihood. It's 100% likelihood. They truly don't understand the process of looking at heuristics. So we say to them, wait a minute, what is the threat? Are we discounting it? We say there's only a 10% likelihood. Are we discounting the threat? Are we discounting the fact that we have that vulnerability? Or are we discounting the fact that that threat will exploit that vulnerability? Now you can start to make this a little bit more addressable. It's a more concrete expression. The threat of a hurricane, depending upon where you are, can be known, right? We know that Nova Scotia is very low in terms of hurricanes, not zero, but it's much lower than Florida is. In terms of the locale, the threat is very real. Well, what is the vulnerability? Turns out in Florida, we actually build homes, properties, et cetera, to withstand that particular threat. So the vulnerability is better. There's still flooding and other issues. But further up the east coast of the US, the investments are not the same because the threat is just not that common. So the vulnerabilities will be higher. Purposely, they will be higher. But ultimately, it comes down to what does that combination look like to determine likelihood? And it turns out, especially if you work with your insurance underwriters, these likelihoods can be calculated not with precision, but with confidence. Then you can look at the consequences. And we don't look at a consequence. My favorite example there, the hurricane, the grass hut. The consequence is not that the grass hut gets wiped out. That's a given. It isn't the rebuild. What does it take to rebuild the grass hut? The consequence is my livelihood is there. My family could be killed or maimed or injured. I might have had guests. There are other second and third derivative consequences. So to be able to say impact, we really need to understand all aspects of the impact. Often the biggest cost to anything in the enterprise risk space is not the immediate discrete recovery. It's what happens to my reputation, my revenue, to my third-party stakeholders, my customers. That's where the biggest impact comes from and the consequence. So we break it out where we can't control threat, the leftmost column in my risk register. We can control vulnerability. In fact, most of the investments today, especially true in cyber, most investments go into burning down vulnerability. And the last piece, consequences, it turns out we do have the ability to invest there. Restorative things like backup, if you're talking about data, but insurance coverage period, if you're talking about maybe covering the operational losses from an outage. That helps us be more concrete than the simple likelihood and impact that most risk frameworks speak to consistently.
Great. And along those lines, the idea that there may be more than one consequence to a given risk, and that you would want to mitigate more than one if you can. You need to pay attention to all of the potential consequences that add up to a risk. And we've talked in the past, especially in cyber, about the inherent risk versus the residual risk. How would you work to get an organization to get agreement and alignment on the current risk level?
It's got to start with an assessment. We have to have an assessment. And of course, there's like any other thing like predicting the weather, there's always chance. But you have a better chance of having a high confidence assessment if you start with those three columns we just talked about: threat, vulnerability, consequence. Start with a qualitative assessment. This is often the most powerful part of the risk level agreement, to get everybody around the table. Get your C-suite involved in a simple workshop for 30 minutes, lay out the top 3 or 4 risks, and argue qualitatively about whether that threat is realistic. Is it really going to have an opportunity to exploit our vulnerability? And ultimately, what really are the consequences? Just qualitatively now. And you might use a 3-point Likert scale like a traffic light. I prefer a 5-point Likert scale because it gives people some room to go back and forth and say, yeah, it's not really medium, it's a high medium or something. But you can also go, some of our clients use a 10-point Likert scale. What's important is that it's forcing the dialogue to get us all on the same page qualitatively about where this risk starts.
I think that's an important point. You can, if an organization is just starting down this path, and hopefully every organization has towards a risk management process, starting with a 10-point scale may be beyond their. It may be more precise than accurate, and therefore they're spending more time being very specific in areas where the general assessment is sufficient. So you said you prefer a 5-point scale. I know we've seen the whole mix of 3, 5, and 10. It depends on the environment that you're applying it to and its level of maturity. For qualitative or quantitative assessments, what's the next step?
So I like to keep it simple, even though I'm a full advocate of things like the ISO 31000 model, FAIR model. I like to start simple so that folks don't get turned off immediately by hours, days, or weeks of this planning activity. Start with a single loss expectancy. What do we think that might be? And you can be provocative. I like to do this when we first get started. I like to throw out outrageously large numbers and have everybody discount immediately and say, it's a $5 million number. What are you thinking? Thinking 1 million then? That's where you start to evoke participation in the discussion. If you leave it as a blank sheet of paper, no one knows where to begin. Refining that, though, is to go check with finance, because finance can probably tell you, no, Scott, that's a $5,000 problem. That's not a $5 million problem. That's good. We anchor on that and we refine it with the group, usually the C-suite, in the discussion. Then comes the annualized rate of occurrence. Well, how likely is that going to happen? Is this a 1 in 100-year storm? Or is this something that's going to happen likely a few times a quarter? to us. Again, if you haven't been in business a long time, you won't have any heuristics or any sense of, what your past experience has been in similar companies. And go to your insurance company. Insurance companies love to see risk registers like this because they see that you, the one that they are basically insuring the risk, you're putting thought into. They will bring you information about the exact same scenario in your market with other businesses. And they will give you a sense for the number that you put on SLE is pretty good, but it's maybe going to drift about 20% north or south. The ARO, this isn't 1 in 20 years, guys. This is happening, 1 every 2 years for people in your market, especially in your geography. They can give you more concrete numbers. They're all planning numbers, but they give you a greater sense of confidence in being able to really, now all of it rolls up to likelihood and impact. This really is measuring the impact. What could that potentially do to damage the business and our, assets and liabilities or cash flow?
Yeah. You mentioned insurance. It's worth noting that financial services in general and insurance in particular have more background in this than other organizations. So driving this into other non-financial, risk-focused businesses is a harder lift, just because they just don't have the background on this. And as we've engaged with chief risk officers or general counsels or the risk committees on the boards of our clients, that comes through. The ability to articulate risk gets to be more important as an organization grows, but it also depends on the circumstances of the business and the experience of the executives. So how do you use this to prioritize what you ought to pay attention to, what you ought to mitigate, and the choices that you make along the way?
That's where these gold columns coming on the right-hand side, not just qualitatively, but quantitatively. How do we prioritize and rack and stack the risk? Because as a leadership team, we can't look at all the risks in the business, right? Joel and I have both been at companies in the past that carried well over 1,000 risks on their risk register. How do we bring the risks that are truly strategic to the top? Well, we sort based on qualitative, but also that quantitative number. Qualitatively, we might have something that's a very high risk, but when we look at it through the quantitative lens, we can simply accept it. It's very likely it's going to happen. And it's an important thing, but quantitatively, we can self-insure. We can simply accept the risk at its face and not go through the mitigation. This is the only way you can tell elephants from fleas in a risk table that gets very dense and continues to be refined. So those two numbers together, again, we're trying to keep this lightweight. We don't want to make it to the point where you need a risk certification in order to be able to run an exercise like this, but definitely do the qualitative and the quantitative pieces, and they get better over time. But they inform that downstream decision about what are we going to do about these risks. And they also drive you to just focus on the top X%, because that's all you've got bandwidth to cover.
So how do you deal with the broad range of available controls, the mitigation steps? How would you select from the results of your assessment, and having built out this part of the risk scenarios and their qualitative and quantitative results?
This is another place where we've often seen the eyes glaze over because people get overwhelmed by the smorgasbord, right? You give them an a la carte menu that's 1,000 options long, and they look at it and they say, I don't know what to do with this. Structure, give me a decision space.
Yep.
Give me something that I can easily understand, comprehend, and we can put some numbers behind. What does that decision space look like? So we use the idea of a control matrix. This one happens, it's real. It's for an insider threat program. And it is at this level for risk practitioners, it may seem superficial, but as a communication mechanism, it's proven to be huge. With the C-suite, especially when the CEO is carrying this to the board or general counsel or CFO, They go into the board and they say, we've got to do something about, risk 9, insider threat, quantitative and qualitatively, it's right at the top. We feel like we've got to burn this down. And here is a set of controls that we're thinking about. That doesn't mean we're going to do everything off from this sheet. But if you look left to right, we want to try to prevent the risk. What we can't prevent, we would like to detect. And certainly we'd like to be able to correct. And at least in the cyber world, I know, Joel, you know this one painfully well. Everybody wants to start with technical. Fact is, the easiest place to start is with administrative, training, policies, procedures, standards, things like that. And then work your way down to enforcing things through physical or technical controls that cannot be circumvented. But this gives us a decision space that when we walk in the room, we can say, we want to start with a new policy on responsible AI. Before you jump to asking, can we technically block people from putting confidential information into an AI tool? Let's start with at least administrative controls. And what do we do to correct it if people actually spill it? It's simplistic, but it's proven to be very effective in terms of getting everybody into the conversation and actively participating rather than passively avoiding the discussion because they're overwhelmed.
So I'll foot stomp your desire for preventative controls in every environment. Well, why don't we just have the tool that fixes that? Because it's not just preventative, but preventative technical controls that people want. Keep us from doing bad things, keep everybody from doing bad things. And in many cases, that simply doesn't exist for the environment that they're in, or it's so onerous to the capability that they're trying to deploy that it destroys the value of what they're trying to bring into being. So there's a full matrix. There are 9 boxes on this matrix, and all are available. And one of them is don't do bad things. Here are the bad things you shouldn't do. And that kind of policy statement can go a long way to at least set the stage and not just look for the things that are in the technical preventative box. So things are expensive. New tools are expensive. You're layering more tools and controls into an environment. It has impact and costs. How do you communicate that? How do you get that to a board? How do you get the fact that an audit committee ought to be pushing for something rather than just asking questions?
In many of the environments we go into, of course, they haven't invested in a GRC platform, which is longer term. That's the more scalable, mature approach, is to invest in a GRC platform. What we'll do is extend our risk register with just some cost columns and say, you're proposing a solution, Joel, Scott, Mike, all right, bust it out for me. What would it take to play the first 5 or 6 cards from that last matrix? The administrative controls, maybe there's a physical control that we don't have, and 2 additional technical controls that deal with both preventative and detective. What does that look like? Here's where we would go through cost analysis. And again, it's not behaving itself. There we go. We go through this cost analysis, which says, what is the cost of these controls? And I'm trying to zoom in. There we go. Administratively, maybe $100,000, both to implement new policies and procedures, but also enforce them. Maybe you need to hire somebody who's responsible for that. And technically, maybe it's another $650,000 for a 500-person organization to, I don't know. We'll do, in this case, it might have been insider threat, so maybe that's DLP and user administration, or user activity rather monitoring. The point is, start to build your shopping list off from that matrix, cost it out, and then have the discussion, is the juice worth the squeeze? Yeah. And that's going to look like a simple cost benefit analysis where, note for that top line, that one's criminal threat and extortion. We're talking about a 1.3 annualized now, a $1.3 million risk. And the team has proposed spending $750,000. These numbers are close to be deliberately provocative. Is it worth the spend? It may not be. That's the agreement piece in risk level agreement. Yep. Are we going to accept that risk of 1.3 million because right now we can't afford the 750,000? Or do we decide to proceed because due diligence has informed this, due care would suggest that if we can reasonably afford this path, that we follow this path. That shows we're not being willfully ignorant, we're not being negligent, we're actively engaging. Or is there another option? Maybe we ask the team to go back to the drawing board and come up with a plan B that is more cost effective, take 2/3 of the expense on this line. That would be more palatable right now to the budget and the board. But that is what we talk about when we say, what is the risk level agreement?
And I think that's the fact that there are multiple controls identified, that the administrative and the technical controls have a cost. And sometimes the administrative controls are really inexpensive. They're not fail-safe, but they're really inexpensive. So looking at that rather than the reflex to say, oh, we got to buy another tool, can change the dynamic here. And the tool might be cheaper, it might be a different tool based on the administrative controls you can put in place. So the A in agreement, the A in or the agreement part of a risk level agreement is getting to conclusion about who's involved and what their position on things is. Can you describe that?
Absolutely. So I want to step back to that risk level objective. And this is often where people won't agree because they have unstated objectives.
Yeah.
Where they call them implicit assumptions if you want, but they're not put on the table. And we need to get them all to come to that same conclusion that this particular risk is worth mitigating. And we probably also want to make sure that our insurance policy burns it down. So we're going to transfer some of the risk to our underwriter. That's where we need the first level of agreement. We're all agreeing to move forward with some mitigation as represented by this cost structure here. And part of this is a corrective action, since maybe we can't recover from the theft, the data's gone. What we might do is insure ourselves for the corrective control to say we can put ourselves back where we need to be financially, regain the costs to recover, but maybe also insure against an operational or a revenue hit that comes from reputation damage. Getting everyone around those two levels of agreement is where we want to codify the discussion. And we actually want this to be a corporate record. We want the whole leadership team to participate in that discussion and get to the point where they say, yes, we actually want to make this investment. Or no, we've decided to defer the investment until next fiscal year where we can better afford it. So now we're going to accept it. What are those dates? What are those timeframes? When did we decide, if we did? When did we last review the decision? Because these things should be reviewed with some frequency, at least annually, but maybe other events happen cause that to be more frequent. When is the next time this needs to be reviewed? Keeping the simple decision right here about that one row at the top, that was one risk scenario and one risk level agreement where we decided that our appetite for risk, this was exceeding our appetite. This was definitely in the threshold above that, and we wanted to drive it back down. So get to a format here of documenting this decision. It does not need to be a board resolution, a management resolution. Let's make it practical so that we can do it more often, so that it's approachable. People don't avoid these discussions when they know they can actively contribute to the agreement.
Yep. And then what do you do once you come to the agreement? How broadly do you share it?
It depends upon what that risk is. Definitely, I would share these to the board so that the board sees the action being taken. And in communicating to the board, I like the trustee risk matrix. There's all kinds of people that just malign the risk matrix, and other people I think use it maybe inappropriately. But I've never seen anything get more alignment from a board. Remember who these people are. They're usually accountants and attorneys, but they could also have been retired practitioners in your market space. They all speak this simple language of risk. It is their job. So let's give them the landscape of risk in terms that they're now familiar with, the likelihood and the impact. Let's map it out now using the qualitative numbers let's push it forward into a traditional view and say, this is where they are to begin with. The proposals for this quarter, what we're communicating to you, the board, is that we're going to continue to drive down risk. These are the new risk level objectives. The objective is to push everything down and to the left, usually down in likelihood. You know, it's not often we push things to the left. They understand that basic set of large muscle movements. And now you can have more discrete conversations where you can drill into one seems to be the most threatening risk here. Now let's have a deeper conversation. Joel, Scott, Mike, bring up your risk register, talk about the discussions, rationalize how you got to the point where you have plan B rather than plan A, and that's what we're going to go forward with. And we see engagement. We see engagement. We see enlightenment. People get it because they can work with it. And if they can carry it away, like the CEO would understand this and can carry it into the boardroom, you've empowered them, rather than giving them something that's just extra weight to carry.
Yep. So there's additional there participations participants in this. The beyond, certainly with a cyber risk set of scenarios, there's going to have a lot of people who have a lot of opinions, and part of the recognition will be to decide which investments, that is, which new controls or changes in the environment will move multiple risks. Those ought to rise in the priority for the investment strategy around it. Audit committees, risk committees, sometimes technology committees, or the like, are the ones who ought to be paying most attention to the risk management processes of a company. And they ought to have some view into what the cyber risks are, but the principles around this are not unique to cyber. They're a broader set of challenges, but recognizing that you can move the level of risk that you're carrying, and that you can move it again in the future if circumstances change. That you can continue to burn down risks as it goes. It's something that this can demonstrate. And one of the I've found, and you've obviously participated in this too, what I found is the fact that you can demonstrate the progress about moving risk and then moving it further and reducing the likelihood or the consequence. There's real advantage in that, both for the company itself and even perhaps its insurance costs. So the idea that it's a one and done is a mistake. It's hard to get started. It's not that hard to continue, and ought to be continued and to move the organization to a place that it's confident about. I won't say comfortable because that's going too far, but it's confident about.
Here's a question for you. For control implementation costs, do companies add a column, one for implementation, and then also for the annualized cost column?
Yes, you could absolutely do that. For every project, you're going to have fixed costs like implementation up front, and then the variable costs, usually the continuing cost to operate. What is it going forward? Absolutely, you want to have that financial exercise to make it clear that $100,000 is maybe what you acquire a license for a new piece of technology. That is not the cost to operate, right? What is the implementation? What is the long-term maintenance? All of that should be factored in. In the table that we presented, we've rolled it all up into a single spend and annualized the spend deliberately to keep it simple so that we can have the discussion, I almost said argument, we can have that discussion around the scenario that lets us quickly get to an agreement. But definitely don't suppress details, because you don't want a $1.5 million investment to appear that it's only a $150,000 investment, because that's what it costs in the first year.
Yeah, I would note that if it's a substantial investment, it might be capitalized, and you'd more likely want to include the depreciation and operations costs than the capital cost. But how detailed you want to get in the financial analysis of the investment is up to the organization. And if it gets clearer understanding of what the financial ramifications of the investment might be, they ought to choose the method that's most appropriate for their environment.
Well, isn't this what it's going to get started to go down the cyber path? Because we're talking about enterprise risk here today, but in the cyber world, the big argument for cloud was exactly that. You can move it from CapEx to OpEx and annualize it or amortize it across years rather than eating the big price tag right up front. That's true, of course, of the security controls that are in that space as well. So,
Can you
like
talk?
any,
Yeah, can you talk a little bit about your experience dealing with boards and senior management signing off on risk level agreements?
want to start there, Joel? Or you want me to start?
Go for it.
Okay. First, C-suites actively avoid these conversations. They do even for larger companies, and they do because risk is a four-letter word, and I don't mean it as a joke. It is something they don't understand. It's abstract. It's a big thing. They're worried about putting their signature. When we say we're going to make a decision and everyone's going to participate and you're going to be recognized as a contributor, they feel that's a liability, not another control. It turns out it actually is another control where they're demonstrating diligence, due diligence and due care, and documenting. So at the C-suite level, we have to find a way to get rid of that active avoidance and get them actively participating because it's concrete. They see where their value add is. They know they're going to help with identifying risk from their function in the business. They know they're going to help to qualify risk or argue as the lead for marketing spend. This is qualitatively where it sits. They understand how to participate in the debate about what's the financial consequences. What are the damages? The second and third order damages. They also know how to participate with the controls, where you can say, I'm going to make an enforcement here, and it's going to be technical, and no one will ever go to the internet. Wait a minute. That might be your objective to drive risk to zero, but it's unrealistic. The point is they see where they can participate as executives. And usually when everybody is involved in that discussion, they're now willing to say, we as a team made this decision on April 3rd, whatever, and we know we're going to revisit it in 6 months when we acquire that new entity. The board has a very different perspective. The board wants to see this. The board is asking for things like this. They don't want to see, especially in cyber, people drive me nuts. What are the metrics I should bring to the board? You've put two words in one sentence that don't make sense together. Boards manage risk. Bring them an expression of risk. If you're talking about key risk indicators, wonderful. But their job is to say the risk is too high, go back and keep sharpening your pencil, or that makes sense that you've accepted that risk or you've mitigated it now and residual is down where it needs to be. When you bring them the few artifacts that we've shown here, that's where the board now understands how to engage. It's not abstract and it's not down in the minutia level. It's at a level that they can actively participate in. And most of the artifacts you see here were driven from our conversations where the board wasn't getting what they wanted to from the leadership team, happens to be around cyber risk. And there was this impedance between the two.
And there's well, I was going to add that at the board level, there's been a push. I can't say that it's been hugely effective or totally effective, but National Association of Corporate Directors published a cyber risk handbook. I think it was 2018 was the first version of it. And that gave board members a better understanding of what they ought to be asking about, not directing necessarily, but asking about, and hopefully not directing at all. Every once in a while, we've seen one of our clients where the board has really taken a hard stance on a given investment or added control. But that's not as common as trying to understand the specifics of the risk management processes and whether they find them credible and effective, and whether it's actually moving them towards a risk tolerance that they're more confident about. But how to communicate that is a part of the engagement at that level of each level of the company. Engagement ought to be different for the board, for the C-suite, for the IT apparatus, and the user population. You're not going to want to publish your entire risk matrix. In some people would see it as a roadmap of vulnerabilities, but you do want to make sure that you're having a discussion at all levels that are appropriate to those levels about what's important for protecting the business.
So just one sidebar, Joel, just building on what we've already said. I just had this conversation with a young woman who's just joined the board, just late yesterday. She said, I don't know how to show up in the boardroom. Now, she happens to be an astrophysicist, and she happens to be articulate in the language of differential equations. And I said to her, your first challenge is don't make your audience feel stupid. They will passively avoid the engagement if you leave them feeling stupid. Show up with something they can work with. The simplifications we've had here, many risk professionals would say, oh, there's a whole mountain or an iceberg underneath the surface there. And there is. But if you make it too hard for the C-suite and the boards to participate, they simply won't.
Any other further
Mike, unless you have,
questions, Mike?
okay, let's jump into the summary here then.
Yep.
We've hit these points many times. Risk scenarios are your friends. Don't just say risk. It's too abstract. Say a risk scenario. And I'm telling you, I used to tell it as a joke, but it's perfect icebreaker. Hurricane, grass hut, threat to life and limb. Immediately they get on the same page. That's a scenario. I can work with it. Assess that risk. What is it really like? And here is a place where finance, legal, and insurance, they are all your friends. It doesn't matter what functional part of the company you're in, they cover all of it. So work with them. Characterize the tolerance and make sure you get those risk level objectives, the implicit assumptions people carry with them, get them on the board, write them down. You will be shocked at the divergence in the different execs and functions that are participating. Make it clear. Then recommend the controls in a way that they can understand them. Don't show up with a laundry list and say, Joe, I think you and I were talking about somebody that showed up with a laundry list of like, I just need $3 million. You're never going to get engagement like that. Show them a decision space. Show them there are options. Get it to the point where they, after they hear you present your matrix and why you're choosing what you're choosing, they could retell the story for you. They become your champions if you empower them. Make those decisions at the first level. Are we going to accept this? Are we going to just void it completely and not do the acquisition, not enter that market? Or are we going to play some of these mitigations that we saw in the control matrix presented by whoever is representing? And lastly, there's really no way. There used to be a transfer word in risk science. You can't transfer risk. You are still accountable. You might share the risk with your underwriter, but you truly never transfer a risk. Figure out what are you going to do at the macro level, and then figure out at the micro level, what can we really afford? If we're going to mitigate some of this, can we really afford? Maybe we think we're going to push that whole 5 million projected, consequence off to the insurance company until we see the bid that they put on the table for your policy. And then you're going to look at it and go, it's $5 million. We should just self-insure. Make sure that you cover all those grounds. Characterize the remaining residual risk. You're never going to drive risk to zero. But is that big investment going to move the needle? Is it going to drop it by 10, 20, 30%? Usually, as we said, by reducing the likelihood. Are you going to be able to drop the annualized risk that you carry in the risk register? And the last point, so important after the fact, someone will hold you liable. There will be a damaged complaint, and they will hold you as the defendant. And you'll wind up in court with people like us as expert witnesses that are asked by the judge, can you explain whether the the accused was negligent or not? If you haven't documented any of this, we have nothing to go on. It looks like willful ignorance. You avoided all of these odd, awkward, difficult conversations because it was too hard. That looks like willful ignorance. Instead, document who, what, and when of each of these scenarios, of each agreement on each scenario. Carry that documentation forward, and you show that you were, in fact, diligent. You prove you did your due diligence, you applied due care, even if you didn't drive it to zero. You applied due care in the moment to a reasonable person's standard. So what it all comes down to is you can't make all problems go away. You can't drive risk to zero. And you probably don't want to for the long-term viability of the business. But do it deliberately when you do it and make sure that you can defend yourself when in the future somebody attempts to hold you liable for damages they claim to have received. Joel, anything else you want to put on the table?
No, well, I think I hope we've covered this well. I think the challenge in the cyber risk, particularly, is to make sure that people understand what the consequences are beyond the cyber speak. The agreements that they're coming to are about risks to the business that happen to come from a cyber vector, but they need to be articulated in business consequences, not just cyber consequences. And to the point about the agreement, after the fact, there's always the reflex that says, how did you let this happen? I didn't let it happen. We agreed that we would take this risk while we invested to reduce others. That planful approach for deciding what choices you're going to make, in what order, at what level, really is the heart of the results of this kind of work, so that the organization is taking the risks that it has chosen to take and mitigated the ones that they think are the most important. And you can't do that just by panicking over the fact that there's 43 risks and we don't know which ones we care about.
Hopefully we've left the audience with some things to think about, some tools that they can use in the same conversations with their C-suites and their boards. And we're happy to engage offline. We're happy to share content examples of the workbooks and things that we work with all the time. We don't sell that. These are just tools we use to facilitate the conversations. And we hope you'll find them as useful.
And the basic tenets of this can be really effective. If calling it a risk level agreement gets in the way, rather than helps get to conclusions and develop a strategy to manage the risks in your environment, keep it as simple as you can to get forward motion. And don't let it get stuck just because it sounds like a big job. I'll say that I did have a client we had a client about 3 years ago whose CFO had started a risk management initiative, and it turned into months of meetings. And after a while, it was abandoned because it didn't really get to the crux of the matter, because it was trying to take on too much in too much detail, and the participants weren't seeing the concrete results soon enough to feel like it was going to inform their decisions. So keep it as simple as necessary to gain some momentum.
Well, thank you, Joel and Scott. That was a great session. A number of you reached out to me in regards to a recording. We did record the session for those of you who want to retake a look at the session or want to share it with your teammates. We will get that out to you. And for those of you who wish to get CPAs and didn't fill out the information when you registered, please get me your information and I'd be happy to make that happen. If you're interested in talking more to Joel or Scott, let me know. I'd be happy to facilitate an introduction, or feel free to reach out directly to them on LinkedIn. Our next roundtable is on October 22nd, Trust Through Transparency, Winning and Keeping Stakeholder Trust, at the same bat time, 12 p.m. And thank you everyone for joining us. Enjoy the remainder of the day. And this completes this briefing. Take care, everyone.
Thanks, Mike.
Thank you.